As everyone knows, calling the US president the American boss is really just the joke people make online. But there was one president who genuinely acted like a mafia godfather. Back then, whenever Americans mentioned him, they'd ask each other, "So, how many people did he kill today?" Yup, this infamous boss with the worst public reputation was none other than Lyndon B. Johnson. In his early years, Johnson was a nobody in Washington. When he was 23, he spent 42 days delivering 200 speeches to help his boss, Kleber, campaign for Congress. He worked himself so hard he ended up in the hospital. But Kleber didn't forget his loyal little helper. He introduced Johnson to Roosevelt, who was about to become the big boss of America. Johnson knew Roosevelt loved fishing, so he just kept flattering him nonstop, basically smeared honey all over his lips. With that much sweet talk, of course Roosevelt remembered him. One little push from the big guy later, and Johnson went from a Texas office assistant to a clerk in the U.S. House of Representatives. Before Johnson left, his dad even reminded him, "Just keep flattering Roosevelt. Everyone else can go to hell." And right after Johnson arrived in Washington, his dad literally did go to hell. As for Johnson himself, Washington didn't treat him much better. He got a tiny office like, hidden in a corner tiny. But Johnson didn't want to stay a nobody forever. So he shamelessly went around asking a congressional big shot for a loan $1 million to build dams and bring electricity to rural Texas. The money didn't really matter. The point was to create some achievements so he could run for Congress in the future. In 1941, at age 33, Johnson ran for Congress. He started strong between his fast-talking speeches and Roosevelt's backing. He led by 5,000 votes. But his opponent, O'Daniel, was an old fox who simply bought votes and overtook Johnson right before the election ended. Johnson was stunned. He hadn't realized American politics had this many shady tricks. Having learned his lesson, Johnson spent the next 8 years doing nothing except networking, showboating, trying to get noticed. He flew around in a beat-up helicopter to every little village, landed, shook hands with locals, and introduced himself like a traveling salesman. Eventually, with enough shameless self-promotion and support from a Texas power broker, he finally won a seat in Congress. And like I said earlier, if you want to become America's boss, the bare minimum is being a senator, governor, or congressman. Johnson definitely planned to keep climbing. Since he didn't really have any special skills, he kept hugging bigger and bigger political thighs. He cozied up to Senator Russell, a major Democratic leader. After 2 years of making the old guy laugh, Johnson became the party whip, which basically means the enforcer of the party. A kind of political red baton, if you know triad ranks. But Johnson wasn't satisfied. To climb higher, he even went to suck up to the current president. Eisenhower, Republican. Like, bro, your own party is Democratic, aren't you afraid your own guys will kill you for this? But Johnson didn't care. He wanted power so much he'd kiss up to anyone. Even groups his own party hated, he'd still fake a smile fool. When the Democratic primaries came, Johnson tried sucking up to everyone imaginable, and still lost to young John F. Kennedy. But Johnson reacted fast. If he couldn't beat Kennedy, he'd just switch to licking Kennedy instead. He secretly called JFK and offered to support him with all his connections in exchange for the vice presidency. Kennedy basically said, "Sure, whatever, VP is just a decorative job anyway." In January 1960, Kennedy barely defeated Nixon and became the president. Johnson became vice president. But Johnson soon realized something felt wrong. He felt like Kennedy's pet dog. Kennedy didn't treat Johnson like a real member of the administration, just kept sending him to do random errands. One day, he'd make Johnson visit NASA. The next day, he'd send him to an elementary school. And when he really had nothing for him to do, he'd ship Johnson off to some foreign country to observe and write a reflection. Johnson hated wandering around, doing useless tasks. He'd come back just to see Kennedy glowing in the spotlight, while he stood awkwardly on the side like a clown. To make it worse, the public openly mocked him, calling the VP useless, a sidekick, a nobody. Johnson even thought about retiring early. But while he was sulking, Kennedy suddenly died. Johnson never imagined he'd become president simply by picking up the vacancy. In November 1963, Johnson replaced the very fairy-tale-minded Kennedy as the new boss. But the timing was awful. Kennedy left behind a giant mess, and only 1 year remained in the term. If Johnson couldn't clean it up, he'd had zero chance of winning re-election. And this happened to be the period when America was tearing itself apart domestically. Black Americans were demanding equal rights, while many white Americans hated the idea of sharing even a public toilet. Kennedy's old cabinet didn't respect Johnson, either they refused to cooperate. And Johnson couldn't fire them, because there was only a year left, no time to rebuild the whole team. And the biggest headache, Vietnam. Back when Truman decided to meddle in Vietnam, a bunch of arms dealers were eager to make money from war. Under Kennedy, the US had already sent over 16,000 advisors. Johnson had never understood why Kennedy insisted on getting involved in this faraway conflict. Until the arms dealers knocked on his door, then he got it. Kennedy had been doing everything with a gun metaphorically pointed at his head. And Johnson, who had climbed his entire career by flattery, knew he couldn't afford to offend these daddies. He begged them to wait until after the next election once he secured a full 4-year term. Then they could make money. But for now, he needed political achievements to get re-elected, especially on civil rights. The arms dealers agreed to hold off temporarily. And magically, the civil rights bills that Kennedy couldn't get passed suddenly went through Congress the moment Johnson proposed them. With those achievements, Johnson soared in popularity and won re-election overwhelmingly. Now with his seat secured, he had to fulfill his promise to the arms dealers. They told Johnson to send troops to Vietnam and increase military spending. Johnson panicked. He had just promised the American public that he would not send young men to die in Vietnam. But the arms dealers didn't care. If you don't escalate, we can test whether your skull is harder than Kennedy's. By 1964, Johnson was still considered a hero almost comparable to Lincoln. But 1 year later, he became Sour Turnip Johnson, the most hated president in America. After his re-election, the arms dealers forced him to massively expand the war. They dumped mountains of expired ammunition in Vietnam's jungles paid for by US taxpayers. Johnson couldn't let the public know, of course. So after clearing out a year's worth of expired weapons, he tried to negotiate peace with North Vietnam. Johnson figured Ho Chi Minh just wanted money. He even offered to help build North Vietnam with $1 billion in aid. But Ho Chi Minh was a revolutionary, not a businessman. He only wanted one thing, a unified Vietnam. He publicly declared, unless the US withdraws from South Vietnam, we will fight until 1999. Johnson wanted to withdraw, but the big bosses wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, civil rights chaos in the US kept getting worse. Southern states ignored Johnson's civil rights laws and even tried to strip Black Americans of voting rights. Blacks and whites fought daily in the streets. Johnson didn't rush to take sides, he just sat and watched TV. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lost it. He called out the government for spending millions daily supporting South Vietnam, saying Black Americans at home were treated worse than monkeys 8,000 miles away. Johnson freaked out. Bro, you're the boat, do you not want to live? Johnson quickly came out to defend civil rights, declaring that all US citizens had equal voting rights, and any state that violated that was challenging the federal government. But in Vietnam, the war was spiraling into disaster. The arms dealers wanted 5 more years of dumping weapons. Johnson was trapped. He knew he wouldn't win another election, but being hated by voters was still better than being murdered by arms dealers. In March 1965, despite US support, South Vietnam got beaten all the way back to its own capital. Johnson nearly passed out. How do you lose with us backing you? American elites then warned, if America loses South Vietnam, it means we lost to the Soviet Union. The Cold War is at its peak, you can't back down. The arms dealers also had another batch of weapons that needed disposing, so Johnson held a meeting with his cabinet. Only one guy, Deputy Secretary of State George Ball, opposed the war. Everyone else supported escalation. Johnson had no choice. He announced the deployment of 125,000 more troops, with more to come. American young men, clueless about what was going on, were shipped off to Vietnam like packages. Johnson didn't dare tell the public how much money was being burned in Vietnam. It would have caused the national meltdown. But truth can't stay hidden forever. For months later, a journalist broadcast the real situation. US soldiers were burning Vietnamese civilians' homes. Then MLK dropped another bombshell. Each Vietnamese death cost the US $320,000, all taxpayer money. Americans exploded in rage. They blocked Johnson's posts every day, shouting, "How many people did you kill today? How much money did you waste?" This went on for 2 years. Johnson finally realized his reputation was finished, ruined by arms dealers and powerful elites. He just wanted the next election to arrive so he could step down. He didn't want to be president for even one more day. In April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy, another enemy of the elites, was killed. Johnson immediately announced he was withdrawing from the next election. He couldn't beat the big bosses, so he ran.